All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to the April edition of the NodeRED Ask Me Anything question. So we're going to get started very shortly. Just to introduce our kind of two experts, NodeRED experts, Nick O'Leary, who's the co-creator of NodeRED. Welcome, Nick, and Rob Marcer, who's the FlowForge developer educator. So these sessions have been always great. We've always had great questions. So looking forward to kind of hearing what people have, what's on top of their people's mind this month. So welcome. Why don't we kind of just jump into it? We've got three questions that we're asking in advance, so we'll start with that. Just as a kind of couple of points before we get going. The session is being recorded. We will post the recording on the our YouTube channel. We will send it out to everyone afterwards. So if you want to use it as a reference, to ask questions, live questions, please use the Q&A pod at the bottom of the screen. It's much easier for us to kind of track the questions there. If you ask them in the chat, they often will get lost. So please try and use the Q&A chat pod. All right. So like I said, we had some pre-advanced questions, so we'll get going with that. But feel free to ask questions, start asking questions in the chat pod as we get going. So the first question was, I'm working with NodeRED on Azure and monitoring an ESP32 using Somato to configure. I need to send the captured data to a database. I've tried MySQL, but without success. Any tips for this situation? So I think it's probably really kind of what are the tips around kind of interacting with a kind of a SQL database?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, without knowing exactly what problems you're hitting, it's hard to give a specific advice. It might be quite a simple, thing that's getting in the way. It might be worth making sure that. So I assume that you're using one of the MySQL custom nodes which are available within NodeRED. I'd make sure that that's one that's being updated. Check it's one of the ones that's been updated more regularly. It's more likely to work well. But beyond that, I'd be checking the credentials that you're using, perhaps in a MySQL client, to make sure that you can interact with the database from outside of NodeRED okay. I would be checking quite often with databases, potentially there might be some sort of IP locking down, so only certain IP addresses can talk to it. So I would be checking that as well, seeing if you can access it from one place but not from another. It might be that where you're running NodeRED, you need to make sure that the relevant IP addresses are added to MySQL. But then if all of that's working, and you're then getting what will work on NodeRED will work everywhere else. So I would try and write your queries and test them out, perhaps in a MySQL editor, and get a rough idea of how you're trying to interact, read or write the data, and then translate that into NodeRED. Once you've got it working separately. There's probably some stuff I missed there. Don't know, Nick, if there's anything that comes to mind for you.
Well, I would say I wouldn't necessarily say that one database works better than others as far as NodeRED. There are nodes for many of the popular databases out there, and we suddenly see people having great success across the board. Maybe just like change the angle slightly is thinking a bit about what you actually want to do with the data, and why you're storing it in the database. There are some other databases that are perhaps more geared up for doing sensor data and time series data, things like InfluxDB, things like that. So whilst that isn't necessarily addressing your issues with the MySQL side of things, it's also interesting just to have a step back and just think about what your goals are for what you're going to do with the data once it's stored. And certainly NodeRED makes it super simple once configured to drop into a database. But then you will quickly get to the, okay, now I've got all this data, how can I do something useful with it? And as I say, we see a lot of people working very well with InfluxDB, which works well for sort of sensor data type use cases. But there are plenty of databases out there, and ultimately it depends what you're used to using and what you're experienced with using. So in terms of getting to the bottom of your specific MySQL issue, by all means, jump on the forum with a bit more detail, and we're more than happy to try and help get to the bottom of it.
Great. Okay, so kind of going on to the next pre-asked question. How do we get responsive screens? So kind of they've got kind of different screen sizes that they want kind of a NodeRED UI to be able to show up from smartphones to monitors. So kind of how do we go about doing that?
So this is, I'm presuming this is in the context of NodeRED dashboard for creating the dashboard UI rather than the NodeRED editor. So the NodeRED editor, I'll quickly say, hasn't really been optimized for mobile screens. It works well at sort of the tablet level screen, but yeah, it's not really. We've never really put a lot of work on making the NodeRED editor very mobile friendly. But as I presume your question is more around the application UI, the dashboard. NodeRED dashboard, it has a degree of responsiveness in terms of how it auto lays out boxes, the groups on a page, and you do kind of have to finesse your groups. So don't have your groups too big, and it's kind of part of the trade-off of NodeRED dashboard in terms of how quickly you can get things on a page. It can be a bit of a challenge to make it as responsive as you might want. So that is kind of a restriction or a limitation of NodeRED dashboard. Rob, I know you spent some time comparing with FlexDash and UI Builder. If you want to say a bit about those two and
yeah,
what you might have there.
Yeah, and I think I'm putting this in the right place. I've hopefully posted a link to an article that I worked on about a month ago talking about this very thing. So yeah, we were looking at a couple of alternatives to build dashboards, and that is the ones we looked at with FlexDash and UI Builder. They both definitely have better support, or are more focused on working better from a responsive point of view. I would think it's fair to say there's a slightly steeper learning curve, so you might find it harder to get going initially, but definitely there is the opportunity there to create things that will pretty much respond correctly to whichever device they're running on. And on dashboard, as Nick was saying, I've definitely found ways to make things look very good for mobile or for desktop. I think what's quite hard without having two separate URLs, because that seems a little bit of a sidestepping it, but without having those two URLs, it can be quite hard to make things work well in both scenarios. But definitely, as I say, I posted a link to an article where we compared the three, so I think that's worth taking a look at.
Thierry, I think this question came from you, and I've actually allowed you to come on and ask a follow-up question if you want to just get a clarification. You'd have to unmute yourself though. If you don't want to, that's fine. Okay, so I don't think he wants to. So we'll move on. So the next question was seeing a few projects that are integrating NodeRED with ChatGPT. Seems that a different desktop client is used to do this. Is there a list of NodeRED FlowForge third-party clients? I see Autonom Labs has released one, but are there others? Is there an LLM that's focused on NodeRED? Thanks.
Yeah, so it's not something that I've looked at particularly, other than when looking at these questions 10 minutes ago, I just started to have a bit of a look around the custom nodes that are available. There is certainly, and this isn't a recommendation, but necessarily, but there is one that comes up as seeming to be updated in the past few days with hundreds of users a week, which might be worth having a look at. But until I've actually tried hooking that up to the API and set myself up a test developer account, I can't be sure. But I mean, quite often with custom nodes, if they're being used a lot, if they're getting updated a lot, that can suggest that they may be a good place to start, and perhaps also looking over if the GitHub project to see what people are discussing on there might also give you a good steer as well.
Yeah, I'd say it's not something I've spent a lot of time digging into, so I can't. I mean, certainly I've not seen anyone do a NodeRED specific LLM, but we are seeing more and more people playing in that area. One of our longtime contributors to NodeRED, Yoke-san from Hitachi, has actually posted a couple really interesting pieces via his LinkedIn just over the last few days around some of the work he's done playing with ChatGPT, generating flows and looking at using it in the function node. So it's a really interesting space, but not one I've had the bandwidth to really immerse myself in yet. So
okay, right. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting space, but it's very much an emerging space. I don't think the person who asked that question's on, but I think it's certainly of interest to lots of people. So just as a reminder, if people do have a question, please, actually, okay, so it looks like John. So John, did you have a follow-up question to that, or maybe just in the chat? Actually, okay, so John's good. Ben Orchard just put something in the chat about that. There looks like they're doing some work on it. So hopefully, Ben, you'll start publishing that too. But yeah, so cool. So Mohammed had a question. Node UI is going to change. I'm not actually sure what that question would be. Maybe just put a follow-up in the Q&A for that. So another question that we have is when considering using loops versus splits and joins and flows, I've read that loops are not ideal way to work in NodeRED. Is this correct? What are the problems with loops? Rob, do you want to kind of?
I suppose, no, I think I might actually ask Nick to his opinion on this. I think what seemed really natural to me is, yeah, using loops, but then I can see sometimes that it seems tidier to use split and join, as the question was saying. So yeah, perhaps Nick, what's considered, if there is a right way, or
so I think it depends largely on the specifics. There are certainly times when either approach is right, but if we think about what do we mean by the question, loops versus splits? So when you want to process some data, let's say you've got a list of I don't know, let's say it's a list of 100 email addresses and you want to send an email to each of them. Now, if you're doing traditional programming, lines of code, you might write a for loop that loops over that list, and for each one does the work, sends an email, does whatever it needs to do. And in a NodeRED flow, you could picture what that might look like, how you would have literally a loop in your flow, but you would need some sort of logic to work out how do we break out of that loop. Now, the alternative is the split approach, which is if you think of that array of messages in the NodeRED context, you're going to have one message with this list of email addresses in it. Using the split and join nodes, you can turn that one message into multiple messages. So one message for each entry in that list. So you could then build a single flow without any visible loop, where one message comes in which has this list to a split node. It can then split that one message into 100 messages, one per email. And then for the next section of flow, you can just treat it as each message is just dealing with one email address at a time. So you aren't looping, you are kind of breaking down the work you want to do into one message per piece of work, rather than trying to work out how do you iterate through a list by creating a loop and keeping track of which one you're currently working on and all that sort of, there's a lot of extra overhead you need there. And then if you want, you can use the join node at the end of that sequence, which will bring together all of those messages back to one, so that you can then carry on the flow once you've finished working across all those individual messages that you've split that one message up into. So that's certainly one pattern. And I think that makes for a cleaner flow to look at and sort of reason about. But there are times when loops are just as valid. For example, if you need to wait for something, you need to wait for some external state to change, but perhaps the API is something you have to poll, that there's no way for it to tell you that it's ready. So there you do end up having to create a visual flow that does have like an HTTP request node that can check the status, and then build that flow that if it's not yet ready, bring a wire around with perhaps a delay node because you want to wait a little bit before you try again, and then put that back into the HTTP request node. So there you do have a literal loop in your flow because it's something you just need to keep doing until some state changes and you can carry on the flow. So yeah, it's not necessarily as simple as saying loops are bad, splits good. It does very much depend. But personally, I think a lot of the times, if it's a for loop in traditional code where you're looping over a set of data, then that's a good fit for the split node approach in a NodeRED flow. If it's where you are just having to loop until some condition changes, then create a loop in your flow. You just need to make sure you've got the logic right to break out of the loop so you don't get yourself stuck.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Next question. I'm pushing data into a dashboard chart. Is there a good way to store that data? So if my NodeRED instance restarts, the chart is still populated with the historic data. Rob, do you want to take that? Or
yeah, sure. Yeah. Yes, there is. So within dashboard, if you're using the chart custom node, it outputs the data. If I could perhaps show this, do a way to share a screen. I think I can. One moment. So can you just confirm you see that before I'm talking?
Yep.
Great. So if we're going to use chart, I just need to configure this so it actually appears. So whatever I send through to here, and in this case, it's just going to be timestamps, will just come through to this chart. But if you look, there's also an output on here. So if I hook a debug up to here and redeploy, what we will see if I fire it off a few times is we're now getting the series of data that we've been sending through. So every time I've clicked the button, it's stored it in there. So you can use that output. So then it's thinking about where you want to store that data. You could store it in context. If you wanted to be, absolutely sure, no matter what, even if you create a new NodeRED instance, you want it to be safe, you might want to store it in an external database or like in a file store, whatever seems appropriate. But you can then feed this back into the chart when it's redeployed, and that will repopulate. And I suppose I should actually show the chart. It will repopulate it with all of the information. This is the chart here. Sorry, I know it's completely useless information, but everything that's been sent through to there, which is now within this array, you can push back in when you redeploy. Nick, hopefully that made sense what I was saying.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and it's one of the reasons that the chart node was built that way, to sort of spit out its data. We do know, again, there's some challenges with the chart node around when you have large amounts of data, that you do need to be mindful of what you're pushing to the chart in terms of, does it make sense? A great example of where if your chart is, 400 pixels wide and you're sending it thousands of data points a second, and you want to show 24 hours worth of data type of thing, well, you've only got 400 pixels width amount of data, and the chart node will try and do its best, but that is one of those areas you need to be. It takes a little bit of experimentation, and again, just NodeRED dashboard tries to make it easy to do these things, and sometimes when you want to push it to extremes, you do have to do a bit more work around the edges of it. So do a bit more sort of data filtering and data aggregation before you pass it to the chart. But to the question, that scenario, the chart node will spit out the data. You can dump that into context. If you've got persistent context enabled, you can dump that into a database and then build your flows to when NodeRED starts up again, pull that data back, inject it, and the chart will visualize all that data in one go for you.
Great. So it's going to move on to the next question. Are there any benefits or disadvantages to using global versus flow contexts where a whole project exists on a single tab in NodeRED?
If all of your nodes are in one tab, they all share the same flow context. They all share the same global context. To be honest, there isn't an immediate benefit or cost to using flow or global. All I would say is just because everything's on one tab today doesn't mean you might grow to a point where you decide to add a second tab later. Now, if you choose to add a second tab for new stuff, then you may want to make sure it doesn't collide with what you've got on the first tab. So flow context would make sense. On the other hand, if you decide to then refactor what you've got and move some of it to another tab, then they've now got different flow contexts. And if that's an integral part of your flow logic, you would, in that scenario, would have preferred to have been using global context all along. So it's kind of, again, I wouldn't say there's a hard and fast rule. I think, but it is one of those choices that you need to make and just understand potential consequences later on that, depending how you choose to grow what you're doing in NodeRED. But if you're confident that everything's in one tab and it's going to stay that way, then there's not a lot in it. Personally, I generally choose to minimize the scope of the data. So I tend to default to using flow context for that type of thing, just to minimize the chance that I forget about something and in the future I do add another tab and then I make a poor choice of variable name and I suddenly find myself causing cross communication between the flows I don't intend. So I would personally err on the smaller scope possible for the solution, but
Okay, cool. Rob, do you have anything to add to there, or should we go into the next one?
I'm not as careful as Nick, but I absolutely agree with his approach. So I just seem to use global. But yeah, I can see why that actually doesn't make sense. I suppose I'm not anticipating maybe at some point in the future I'm going to add another, flow within that. So yeah, I certainly wouldn't disagree with Nick's point of view to keep the scope as limited as necessary. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So actually, Pratap asked the question in the chat, and I missed it, but I found it. So, can we send data to SAP directly? And then he did a follow-up with, also, I try and install NodeRED SAP RFC palette. It shows some errors. Can you please show any flow to send data to SAP? So I guess kind of the general question is, how do you send data to SAP?
I don't have any flows to hand to demo that. I'm not an active user of SAP, but I have certainly seen it used quite successfully in the community and in discussions in the community. So whilst I can't just produce a working example for you. I know it is done. I know it is possible. I think if you're hitting some errors trying to install a node, then please do jump on the community forum with details of those errors, and I'm sure the community will help either help you get to the bottom of those errors, or we'll be able to guide you more usefully than I can right now.
Yeah, and I believe that SAP actually has some type of certification or verification of NodeRED and SAP. I see on LinkedIn people passing some type of certification steps. So I'll try and dig that up. But yeah, absolutely, people do use NodeRED to send data to SAP. So yeah, it's possible, but I don't think anyone here really has the deep experience. But just a reminder, please don't try and ask questions in the Q&A pod, not in the chat, because it's that way we don't lose them. So another question: is there any way in NodeRED to capture versions of flows? For example, where the flow has changed a few times and deployed, can I return back to an earlier version if not directly built into NodeRED? Is there any way to do this using third-party tools?
I don't think it's directly built into NodeRED. I think that's fair to say, Nick. Is that?
Yes and no. So in the default NodeRED, no, there isn't version control, but NodeRED does have the projects feature, which you can enable, which does then give you a Git repository on the local file system that your flows are stored in. And you get in the UI. In fact, why don't I, as I have it locally, let me briefly show you. So I have the projects feature enabled. It's a flag in your settings file. When you have that feature enabled, you can then create projects in NodeRED. So these are all different sets of flows or different projects I have. Each one is its own Git repository. So you can very quickly switch between them. And I have my demo project I have here, which is the one I'm using. And then you have the project history sidebar. So if you're familiar with Git, you'll be fairly accustomed to what you get here. So when I deploy a change, you can now see in my local changes, it's showing my flows file as having changed. I can click on it and it shows me a diff of what's changed between those two versions. I can add it to commit. I can then do a commit. So this is all just driving Git commands in a local Git repository under the covers. And then the commit history. So you can see I created the project a couple of hours ago, and here's the commit which added those first flows. So that's all doing version control. Via this, you can actually create branches. You can attach it to a remote Git repository, so you can push changes to Git remote, all that type of stuff. The one thing we don't have, and we added the projects feature quite a while ago, and it's kind of been one of those features we've talked about but never quite got to, is the ability to roll back. So to pick one of these commits and say, take me back to that version. So that feature isn't there, but ultimately it is just a Git repository on the local file system. So you could fall back to the Git command line and go back to previous versions. So that's the projects feature. Let me just quickly highlight it in the docs. User guide is one of these, working with projects. So there's a guide to how to set it up and the general user experience of it, all in the docs. So that certainly helps. Now, I will say, for those of you coming to this from the FlowForge side, we don't enable the projects feature in FlowForge. Within FlowForge, we've built our own mechanism for taking snapshots of projects and all that type of stuff. So it's a slightly different user experience, but the principle is the same, that you can take you can take snapshots of versions, and in Flowforge you can actually revert back to previous versions. We have built that part in.
All right, great. So next question. Sometimes when working on custom nodes, they just fail without outputting any message. Is there a way to deal with this more gracefully?
Well, it's always going to depend on the fine details. One of the things we introduced, and well, in the 10-year history of the project, I can't remember when we introduced it, because it was long enough ago that it feels like we've always had it, but we haven't, is the way that a node can log an error. Nodes can log errors, and it shows up in the error log. We introduced a way that if it logs an error and also provides a message object, then that would trigger a catch node in a NodeRED flow. So I'm just thinking, yes, I can't readily produce a flow that throws the sort of error that would demonstrate this. But so for some nodes that have perhaps been around for a long time, they haven't been updated, or they've overlooked updating their logging of errors to provide this message, which will enable it to trigger the catch node in a NodeRED flow. And all we can do in those instances is appeal to the community to raise those issues against those nodes to get them updated, because that's really the only way that the NodeRED runtime can know that this node has hit an error and that it can be handled in a flow. Otherwise, it's a case of really just trying to understand the nature of the error, trying to work out. Often it's nodes are just missing quite the right error handling, and they can sometimes cause bigger problems by not having the right error handling in them. And that's very much a case of where, that's why we want to hear about these problems in the community, because we take a responsibility in the community to also feed these things back to node authors and make sure the right message gets back to the node authors to where there are those sorts of improvements needed. Unfortunately, there are plenty of nodes out there where the node author has published them and then they've moved on with their life and they aren't maintaining them anymore. So again, we're trying to find a way to help resolve those issues as well. But yes, I think if you're ever in any doubt, just jump on the forum and ask, and the community can help get to the bottom of it.
Cool. All right. Next question is about kind of compiling a NodeRED flow. Is there a way to compile a NodeRED flow so it'll run in Node.js directly? It might be useful to do that. So once we have production code, we don't need to deal with overhead of running NodeRED. Is there much of an overhead with that? So
for a long time, the answer to that has pretty much been no, in the sense that we don't do code generation. So there's not a way for nodes to say, given this configuration, here is the JavaScript code that implements that node's behavior as provided, that could then be inlined into a JavaScript or a Node.js application. Over the last year, there's been a really interesting project. I know we've talked about previously on a previous AMA, I believe, from the guys at Modable, who create a JavaScript runtime for devices, and they're doing some really interesting work to be able to transpile, I guess is one way of describing it, a NodeRED flow so that it will run on a microcontroller without a full Node.js runtime. But so they've created implementations of most of the core nodes and some community nodes, but clearly not the full 4,500 third-party nodes that are out there, because it does require it requires the node to be able to generate the code and provide the code to the compiler. But I think whilst what they're doing is very much focused on compiling for microcontrollers, I think there's some interesting lessons to be drawn out of that for how could nodes be written so that, yes, they can run like they do today, or they could be asked to provide code that can then be embedded into sort of a more static runtime rather than the more fluid runtime that NodeRED has. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting area, but not something we have a full solution on today.
Okay, cool. So just a reminder, we've got one more question. So if people have questions, please add them into the Q&A pod, and we'll be happy to get to them. So I've got an array of objects. Is there a no-code way to find a specific object from an array? Would it be better just learning how to search the array in a function mode?
I think I'll let you have a go at that one, Nick. I think, yeah, you'd be better than I answering that.
So I think that's one of those use cases where dipping your toe into a little bit of JavaScript would give you a whole bunch more superpowers within NodeRED than trying to do it in a purely low-code, a no-code way. I think technically it is possible to do. So if you've got an object in your message, you can pass it to a split node, and the split node will break that up into one message per key value pair. And then you could have a switch node that is looking for whatever condition and have that be able to pull out. Oh, sorry, I've got it slightly wrong. The split node split the array, so you have one message per element in that array, as I was talking about earlier in split versus loop. So an array of objects comes in, a split node breaks that up into a stream of one message per object, and then you could have a switch node that is testing whatever condition you're looking for, and when it finds the object, pass that through, otherwise drop the others. So it is absolutely possible to do in a low-code way. And in fact, as I've described it, it's actually much simpler than I was starting to think. But yeah, I think I think a lot of people who use NodeRED will agree sometimes it is just easier to drop into a function node and write a few lines of code, which, whilst entirely doable with just nodes and a flow, sometimes there are some of those tasks that you can get to your answer a bit quicker with just a few lines of code in a function node. But I think, again, that's one of the nice things with NodeRED. It lets you dip your toe in when you think, okay, I figured out how to create a series of nodes that solve that problem. That's great. Now, I can dip my toe into, well, how could I do that in a function node and maybe remove some of the nodes from my flow to simplify it. But yeah, it certainly, you don't need to get dropped in the deep end of understanding all of JavaScript to be able to start learning those little bits and pieces and tricks as you go.
Okay.
On the split thing you were talking about there, just one thing that might also be worth trying is joining afterwards as well, because so if whatever value you're searching for actually isn't there and you've split and then used a switch, you will never get a message back out the other side. So you might also want to consider how you can set aside that value that you needed and then merge it back down into one message. So you join it back down into one message so you can deal with, oh, yes, we didn't find that particular value within that data. Within that
and it's funny, we spent a bunch of time when we were looking at the split and join nodes and all the behaviors. So that with the switch node, it does have an option to, I forget what the label is, it's like rebuild message sequences, but it's right at the bottom. And the purpose of that was, well, if I've split an array of 100 objects and I'm now passing them as individual messages to a switch node, which might be doing some sort of filtering, and I want a join node that just pulls together what's left. Well, by default, the join node is waiting for 100 messages. And if this switch node has filtered out most of them, then that tick box to saying, you know, repair. Sorry, I've gone blank on what the wording is, but it's about rebuild sequences or something. What it's doing is it's fixing the metadata on all those messages. So the join node finds out, oh, you mean I'm only waiting for 40 messages now, not all 100 type of thing. And yeah, we spent a lot of time thinking through, well, what if that split node, or what if the switch node drops all of the messages from the sequence, so there's nothing left? What does the join, you know, does the join node just never get anything, or should it get something but it's empty? And yeah, and as I talk it through, I can't remember what we do in that scenario. I'm going to go remind myself, but yeah, I think that again, it's some of those edge case. I think it's the edge cases that sometimes you might trip yourself up a bit when you're trying to do it purely through lots of nodes in a flow, and often those edge cases aren't important to you, and you can go a long way without worrying about them. But sometimes those edge cases are something you need to worry about, and that's where, yeah, the flexibility of the function node shouldn't be discounted just because it involves writing a little bit of code.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, Terry Orchard asked a follow-up on function nodes. So what's your view on, or thoughts on having native support for other languages? So kind of, for instance, Python. In a function node, right?
Sure. So there are a handful of Python shell nodes, but from the community, that have kind of been modeled after the function node. Certainly we see for certain domains, there's a lot of ask for, or a lot of interest in having as, I don't know, native as possible integration with Python as possible. A lot of data science stuff has very sort of first class Python modules out there. It's something we haven't really done in the core, because people have created solutions in the community around like the Python node and the like. That said, we certainly have a bunch of nodes, like our Raspberry Pi hardware nodes, that are running Python processes under the covers, and they sort of exec that as a sub process and then just read and write from the stream to pass the data around. Something we never got to, but you know, it's never too late, would be looking at standardizing how you might, if you wanted to create an application in a different language, is there a standard API or interface in terms of how you read and write to it from standard in and standard out type of thing? You know, is there value in us trying to define, you know, if you write a process that accepts messages that look like this, and it prints to console out things that look like that, then it just works in terms of translating that from messages coming in and messages coming out. I don't know. It's one of those, there's never quite been enough interest to pursue it. But right. I think if there is interest, again, please jump in the community and we can have that conversation.
Cool. All right. Well, I think we're done with all the questions. So thank you, Rob and Nick, for your insights here. And as Nick says, kind of certainly if there's other questions, kind of reaching out in the community on the community forums is the best place to start. There's also the Slack channel, the NodeRED Slack channel for questions too, and the response is very high and very quick typically. So don't be shy. But thank you again. We'll certainly be doing this again next month. So please kind of join us and bring all your great questions in advance too. All right. So thank you, everyone.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Cheers then.
Bye.